When you first start woodworking, you get a few sets of clamps and think, alright, this is great. Eventually you add a few more and you think, awesome. Then eventually your collection grows and you end up with clamps all over the place, hanging off tools, piled in the corner, and pretty much anywhere you can stash them. It's time to build a suitable storage solution for all of my clamps. That's why I'm going to build this space-saving wall rack that can hold my entire clamp collection with room to grow. The design is universal, so it can hold any type of clamp, including bar clamps, pipe clamps, parallel clamps, ratchet clamps, F-clamps, mini F-clamps, spring clamps, face clamps, and pretty much any clamp you have. Let's get started. For this build, I'm using 3/4 inch plywood. I'm going to start by making the brackets. As you can see, I've cut 2 strips with one slightly wider than the other. Using the stop block on my miter saw, I'll cut the strips into 8 rectangles that I'll later cut on a diagonal to make the brackets. I have plans available for this build with all the dimensions and cutting diagrams, and you'll find a link to the plans in the description below. I only need 2 wider panels for the brackets on the ends, so I'll grab 2 of the wider boards and cut them down to the same size as the others. To cut the diagonals, I'm going to use my mini crosscut sled. I couldn't fit the panel as is, so I'm using some scrap plywood to raise up the bed. I'll start by cutting the kerf, then use that reference line to line up the panels to be cut. You could also use a bandsaw to make this cut, like Jay Bates does in his clamp rack video. In fact, now's a good time to mention that my clamp rack was greatly inspired by Jay's build video, and I'll leave a link to his video below so you can check that one out too. So after lining up my pencil mark with the kerf, I locked down some stop blocks so I could just swap out the pieces and make all the cuts. You can also nail down the blocks to the sled with a few brad nails to achieve the same result. I just made sure to always have the longer side to my left, and then I could just drop the board into place and make the cut. For the 2 wider pieces that I'll use on the ends, I simply used the previously cut pieces as a template to mark the diagonal. I could then drop it into the sled, again keeping the longer side to my left, and make the cut. The last thing I want to do before I start assembling is cut off these tips, and it worked out so I could just line up the edge with the edge of the sled to get consistent cuts on every piece. For the 2 wider pieces, I again used one of the previously cut pieces as a template to trace the cut, then carried it over to the sled and made the cut by lining up the marking with the kerf line. Alright, so here we are with 14 identical pieces and 2 taller ones, and you'll soon understand why. To assemble the brackets, I need to cut some extra pieces, and these will be for the tops of the brackets. I threw together a quick jig made from some scrap MDF to help assemble the brackets and clamped it to my workbench for stability. I applied some glue and used a few brad nails to secure the top panel. I then repeated this same process to make all 7 brackets. I'm going to use a large backer board to mount the clamp rack to the wall, and this is so I can add extra holders for smaller clamps once the rack is already up. I figured it will just be easier this way, and you'll see what I mean in a little bit. I used a large drywall square to mark the cuts, which I then made with my track saw. Normally, I would have purchased a nice sheet of premium plywood to use as the backer, just for a cleaner look really, but since the entire world is pretty much on lockdown, I'm using the materials I have on hand for this build, hence the unsightly plywood. But I sanded it down and I guess it doesn't look that bad after all. Anyway, here I'm making some simple spacer blocks that I'll use for the assembly process. I clamped down one of the blocks to my assembly table and lifted the backer board into place. I awkwardly was able to throw another clamp on there to help it hold upright without falling over. I then scurried over to the other side and clamped on the other block, and it worked. I started by attaching the outer brackets, which are those taller pieces, right up against the outer edge. I applied glue, then temporarily secured it from behind using a few brad nails. I could then use a spacer block so I could just drop in the next bracket, and again using glue and brad nails to attach it. To help get my nails in the right place, I traced out a grid on the back of the panel before assembly, and all of this is included in the plans if you're interested in building this for yourself. I kept going along the row using the spacer and positioning the next bracket until I reached the end of the row. At this point, the rack was supporting itself, so I could remove the clamp on the end and attach the end bracket, again using glue and a few brad nails. With all of the brackets temporarily secured, I went around making countersunk pilot holes, using the lines as a reference so I could then secure the brackets with some screws. If you're wondering, this clamp rack is 4 feet by 4 feet and can already hold a minimum of 40 beefy parallel clamps, but I'm not quite done yet. I picked out a spot in my shop to mount it to the wall. All of my walls are concrete, which I hate, and let me warn you that the next few steps, I'll just be winging it. I decided to make a few pilot holes at this point and then transfer them to the wall once I had the panel in place. So here I'm wrestling the clamp rack into place. Working alone in a shop means that sometimes you have to come up with creative solutions, like screwing a couple of 2x4s to a piece of plywood and leaning it up against the wall. I then used a long 2x4 to brace it up against the wall so I could grab my drill. And then I used my drill through the pilot holes I had already made to make the markings on the wall. I decided to take the rack back down at this point so I could drill the holes. I used a hammer drill with a masonry bit, and after a while, reached the desired depth. I made sure to blow out the dust, and after making the 4 holes, I lifted the rack back into place and secured it with concrete screws. I won't lie, it was satisfying to see this rack hanging up on the wall after what I just went through, and I'm excited to finally get this thing loaded up. But don't go just yet, there's more to come. So having storage for my long clamps is great, but I still have all of these smaller clamps that I need a home for, so I'm going to cut up some small blocks that will serve this purpose. Here I'm using my pocket hole jig to make a couple pocket holes that I'll use to attach the blocks where I need them. And this was just visually determined by the space I had left over after all of my longer clamps were hung. For the next blocks, I simply used the clamps and visually positioned it so it wasn't interfering with anything. I didn't use any glue on these blocks, and the reason is so that I can reposition them as needed, as my clamp collection evolves. Another addition I want to make is adding a simple dowel to hold my spring clamps. I like this easy solution because you can fit it between 2 longer clamps, and it allows you to just slip the clamps on and off, and you can add as many as you need depending on how large your collection is. The beauty of this design is that you can really customize it to fit your clamp collection, both big and small. I hope I was able to provide you with a few ideas to build your own, and just a reminder that I do have plans available for this design if you want to check those out below. Hey, I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, I'd love to have you, so be sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you'll get notified when I post new videos. Until next time, thanks for watching, see you soon.